Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we are doing another fountain pen related video. Now what you see here on the table is a Jinhao x750 fountain pen, but this in and of itself is not the subject of today's video. The subject of today's video is the nib that is in this pen. This is a Kaigelu, if that's how you pronounce that name, long knife nib. Specifically, if I'm going to read the listing on Aliexpress that I bought this from, this is a one-piece original Kaigelu fountain pen nibs manual long knife grinding nib for Jinhao 100, Jinhao 450, Yongshin 699, and Moonman T1C1. Which is a mouthful, but from what I understand, this nib, I was originally of the impression that this is an architect style nib. Well, apparently it is a sort of pseudo copy of a Naginata Togi nib. I am not too well versed on those, or I know that they are some very expensive hand ground nibs. But I have no experience with one of those. I've just kind of watched a few things, kind of, like with a lot of these sort of listings on places like Aliexpress, it's a little hard to kind of understand exactly what the listing is because, well, the people who make the things and obviously post the things on the marketplace of Aliexpress are not native English speakers, and sometimes things get lost in translation. So, it's a little bit, confusing sometimes. But after watching some stuff, my understanding is this is that supposed to be that Togi style, or that Naginata style of nib, and not really an architect nib. Apparently, the nibs that get listed as blade nibs are architect nibs, and the long knife nibs are Naginata style nibs. But regardless, as of the time of which I purchased this nib, which was just a little while, not like a week or 2 weeks ago, the listing has it for $4.02 if you buy it by itself, as I did, which is about the cheapest you can get one of these hand ground long knife blade etc. style of nibs. Most of the time, if you find a pen listed on AliExpress that has a long knife nib, it's usually a piston fill pen, and they generally going to start somewhere around $30 to $36 and up. Even if the base pen that is in is usually like a $25, $26 pen, there's like a $10 to $15 premium for one of these hand ground nibs. And I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to spend, $35 on a pen with a nib that I wasn't sure I would like. So I was trying to look around to sort of find this style of nib for cheaper. And this is what I found. Now, it says on the listing that these Kaigelu long knife nibs fit a Moonman C1 or T1. I don't have a Moonman C1 or T1, but I do have a Mahjong T5 that has, because Mahjong and Moonman are sort of the same brand, it actually has a Moonman branded nib, and this is a size 6 nib. I can tell you, I don't know if the rest of the Moonman Mahjong size 6 nibs are universal and supposed to be able to swap between pens, but if you have a Mahjong T5, this Kaigelu number 6 nib does not fit the Mahjong T5. The actual tang of the nib, which I'm not going to pull the nib out of this pen, it's inked. I'm going to, for example, use the Jinhao nib that came with this x750 here, which it's in now. The tang of the nib here is wider on this Jinhao and the Kaigelu than on the Mahjong. And I actually, full disclosure, I did take a file and sort of file off the tangs, the sides of that tang end of the nib, this Kaigelu nib, and got it to fit in this Mahjong. But the actual curvature of the nibs are different. And so the curvature of that Kaigelu nib did not match the curvature of the Mahjong nib, but more importantly the Mahjong feed. And even though I was able to get that pin to fit in here without jamming it and forcing it, after I sort of modified it, ink would not flow. So the geometry between that nib and the nib in this Mahjong do not match. Like I said, I don't know what the commonality is between this Moonman nib and this, and potentially the T1 or C1. But even though that listing says that this is supposed to work with Moonman pins, I would be a little skeptical of that. I can't say that for sure, you know, but just this being a Moonman branded pin nib and a Mahjong pin that works properly, and the Kaigelu does not work in that pin, it leads me to suspect it might not actually be compatible with those other Moonman pins. It's a little bit of speculation on my part, though. That being said, this is a Jinhao x750 pin, and it does work in this pin. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of a writing, or, you know, kind of showcase the sort of line variation and everything. Also, will say this to fully disclose, I have already written quite a bit with this, you know, only in the last 24 hours, but I have written a lot and used a lot of ink, you know, quite considerably a lot of ink for the short amount of time that I've had this nib functioning in a pen, because I've had this nib longer than I've been able to use it, because I just recently got this 750 here in the mail so I could actually finally use this nib. But I did have to tune the nib. It was kind of dry writing. I took a piece of 3/1000 feeler gauge and put it between the tines and kind of flexed it back and forth a little bit to get it to flow better. Because it was kind of dry writing. But now that I've gotten it doing that, it works pretty well. Probably going to hard start because I've been sitting here talking with the cap off. But if I do a horizontal stroke, if I get the angle right, because angle is very important to get that broad stroke on this pen. If I get the angle right, it does get a pretty broad stroke when compared to the vertical stroke. Now, I am going to mention this right now because this is going to kind of be maybe a little bit of an issue in my sort of review of this. I have a unorthodox way of writing. Most people write with the pen down below, so you would have a vertical stroke and a horizontal stroke. Well, for me, since I was a little kid, I pretty much grew up learning to write with my hand to the side like this, so you will notice what would be the horizontal stroke for most people ends up being my vertical stroke, and what would be the vertical stroke for most people is my horizontal stroke. So I'm going to say vertical and horizontal, and you'll see me writing sort of backwards, but that's just due to the fact that, you know, I guess I learned how to improperly learned how to use a pen as a kid. But you can see the line weight difference there. Like I said, though, on that wide stroke, it is going to be very dependent on the angle, because the angle at which that nib is ground is very important. To, you know, the angle you have the pen in relation to the paper to get that widest possible stroke. So there's a bit of feel that goes into this. Now, if you start tilting the pen up, it will begin to write progressively finer until you get pretty much vertical, like how you would typically use something like a technical drawing pen, and in which case it writes a very thin line. So you can see this is that line weight change that you see is just me getting, you know, to a more severe angle, and then those last really thin lines there compared to both the horizontal and vertical strokes here. Is that pen pretty much vertical? Now another thing I will mention about this is that this nib is kind of soft. So when you're doing that, like I said, for the average person, a vertical stroke, for me a horizontal stroke, but when you're doing that vertical stroke, if you press on the pen, if you put too much pressure on the pen, it will actually spread the tines a bit, and as you can see, it will lay down quite a bit of ink and make a bold stroke. Now obviously with this sort of asymmetrical type of grind, flexing the pen, it kind of defeats the purpose of having a nib with this grind. But the reason I say that is depending on how you write, this is kind of fairly soft feeling compared to some nibs I've used. So you might not intentionally flex the nib and make that stroke get kind of fat on you when you're writing, but it might just happen, be something that just happenstance as you're writing with the pen. So you just kind of, if you want to see the most variation, make sure you're not pressing on the pen when you're writing, or your thin strokes will fatten up and kind of be the same weight as your thick strokes. Let's see what something. Oh yeah, another thing. I don't think you're gonna. Most people who would use a nib like this wouldn't be inclined to do this anyways, but it doesn't really reverse write. It runs dry pretty quick, and it's extremely scratchy, and it feels like you're writing with a needle. But with as thin of a line as you can get going vertical with this pen, there's really no reason for you to want to reverse write anyways. Now, another thing, just for the sake of comparison, this is a Lamy Safari with an extra fine nib. It has the exact same ink. In this case, this is Noodler's Heart of Darkness ink. And just for the sake of comparison, I'll circle those. The line weight of my Lamy Safari with the extra fine nib is about equivalent to the vertical stroke if I don't put too much pressure with this nib. So there you can see those that are circled are the lines from the Lamy Safari. That little hatch mark there is from the Lamy Safari. But like I said, you gotta make sure you're not gonna push on that pen, because if you're pushing on it, it's gonna fatten that stroke up. But that thin stroke is about the size of a Lamy with an extra fine nib. Maybe just a little fatter. Just a little, but like I said, once again, depends on how much pressure you're putting on when you're laying those lines down. And that broad stroke is at least double the thickness, or maybe 2.5 times the thickness. Now, full disclosure, I mostly use my pens for art, and almost every pen that I have is either an extra fine or a fine, except now for this one and the medium nib that came with this pen. There were some issues with that, so I haven't actually written with the medium nib that came in this Jinhao x750. So I can't really 100%, like I can tell you, it's like this nib from this pen of this size, because, well, my actual experience with various pen nib styles is kind of limited. Now, as far as writing with this, like I said, you're going to have to bear in mind my writing style, my hand position is kind of backwards, like 90 degrees to what most people write. So when I write with this, you're going to see, generally speaking, broader vertical strokes and thinner horizontal strokes. Just realize for the average person who would write with a pen with this nib style, who writes with a more normal hand orientation, it'll be exactly the opposite. So there's a little bit of, like I said, well, this is all going to show up. You can see that line weight change, but like I said again, the way the line weight changes for me due to my writing style is going to be kind of backwards from what most people will see. Almost ran out of paper there. So how well it's going to show up. Now once again, I'm still getting a little bit of a dryness if I do a really quick stroke with the pen. I'm still kind of running dry a little bit. So at least with my example of this nib, if you're a really fast writer, you might end up running out of running out of ink. Now I'm not 100% sure that necessarily that's 100% the nib. Could also just be the issue of the nib and feed combo and this pen. Not 100% sure, being as how, obviously this is an aftermarket nib from one company and the pen made by another company, so there's a little bit of that going on. Now, I'm also going to do a little bit of a writing in this little composition notebook I got here. This is just the cheapest junk notebook from Walmart. So not the best paper for this, but this ink generally behaves well on trash paper, so if anything, I feel like this says that reverse writing didn't really work out in that vertical writing, and so I mean I don't know. If I can once again try to get this piece of paper with this hardcover underneath the camera and everything here. Actually, let me see if I can't turn. Hold on one second. Alright, sorry. I had to move my light. It's around the camera here, so it would interfere with the book less, so I can hopefully get this up underneath the camera for a better view. So, I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera. So I got a little bit of a obstruction with this light here. But you can see the line weight change there as I wrote. Also note that on most of the strokes where the pen strokes end, there's a pretty squared edge. It's not the typical like rounded dot that you see with most nibs. So even if you don't necessarily pick up on the line weight change right off the bat, you can kind of tell that this was not written with just a standard pen nib. And then if you look at those sort of little S squiggly things there, you can see that line weight change. Like I said, in my case here, the horizontal lines are thinner than the bottom of those sweeps, which for the average person with a more normal hand orientation, it would be the opposite of that. You would see these horizontal lines being fatter and the tops of these little you see these horizontal lines being fatter, and then the sides of these little sweeps where I've got the fattest part of my line would be the thinnest for the average person. Now I will say this, looking at it here, this is a college rule book. Now I don't know if anybody that's would potentially maybe end up watching this video who may not be in the United States. I don't know if college rule means anything to you, if you would understand what that means, but on a college rule book, I had a little steel rule over here, but I'll put it away. Essentially, that ruling is about 7 millimeters. It's 7 millimeters between lines. I would say with this particular nib, if you're writing in some kind of book, not necessarily this book, this style of composition book, but on like maybe a dot grid journal or something like that, when you start getting down this low, because these lines are quite bold, especially those horizontal lines, it can get a little bit busy in there. If you write something, you'll probably know what you wrote because you're used to looking at your own handwriting, but if somebody else tries to read your handwriting, it might be a little hard to tell what letters are what, because I would say for ruling this small, the width of that line is probably a little bit heavy. But generally speaking, like I said, most of the time I write with extra fine nibs, which, you know, an extra fine nib in a book like this, you know, looks something like that, which is, you know, generally fine in a ruling this small, but with this nib, it might be a bit much. So, in practical use, if you're going to use a nib like this for writing, you might want to look for a book that has a notebook or journal or whatever. If you're looking at something that's lined, maybe that's got a little bit more of a wider spacing on those lines, so you don't end up getting so cluttered and close together and potentially hard to read. Now, I mostly got this to eventually try to see how it works, maybe as a drawing tool, because you have all the different various line weights. I've done a few little sketches. I'm not going to show them because they were pretty bad. It's going to take a learning curve. In the future, I'm working on trying to get a different sort of camera and mount set up, because the way I've got my camera set up right now, it's actually, I'm having to be fairly far away from the paper when I'm writing. But for inking a drawing or a sketch, I really need to be able to get in closer to see what I'm doing and do details and things. So until I get a different sort of camera mount set up where I don't have essentially a microphone stand sitting between my legs preventing me from pushing my chair all the way up to the table, it's awkward. I'm not going to be able to do any videos of me actually drawing and have it look somewhat competent and decent. So, you know, that might be something I do in a future video. But if I end up not using this for drawing, I'm probably not going to keep a black ink in it. Probably going to end up putting something like this Legal Blue, this Noodler's Legal Blue ink. Something that looks a little bit more vibrant, potentially might shade a little. Because, you know, it does kind of spice up the way the line weight change. It does kind of spice up my writing here. But it would probably look better with something other than this particular ink. So anyways, that's it for this video and this look at that Kaigelu long knife nib. Now, being as how these are hand ground, they're probably going to vary piece to piece. So I've got one example of this nib. It seems to work pretty good. Like I said, I did have to tune it a bit. And you know, maybe in a different pen with a different feed, it may work better or worse than it worked in my pen. There's a lot of variables to that. My example, though, that's kind of what this is, the results that I was getting. I'm mostly happy with it. Like I said, I don't know how I'm going to use it as an art tool for drawing, or if I really can going forward. If it's gonna, I don't know that it's necessarily going to replace, you know, just a standard pen with an extra fine nib for me. But if not, I actually do see myself writing with this. I do like the way it looks. I just, like I said, I'm gonna potentially swap inks. So, you know, that's pretty much all I've got for this video. I hope whoever watched this, you know, you got something out of it. Maybe it was informative to you. Maybe this looks like something you want to experiment with. You know, if you've got a Jinhao x750 or an x450, any of these kind of Jinhao number 6 nib pens, and you're like, hey, you know, what the heck, it's $4, maybe I'll try it out. You know, it's on one of those where you get free shipping over $10, I think, if I remember correctly. Actually, let me pull that page back up over here on the computer. And yeah, free shipping over 10 bucks. Of course, I know some things are kind of changing with global trade right now, but if you can get it for 4 bucks with something else in the order, you know, that's cheaper than buying a dedicated $35, $36, $45 pen just to get a hold of one of these style of nibs. So, you know, having said all that stuff, I hope this was an informative video to those of you that watched it. You know, maybe it'll help you make a judgment on whether you want to try one of these out or not. And, you know, if you got some information out of it, I really appreciate if you hit the like button down there. That'd be nice. Help me out. If you have any kind of comments or questions or suggestions, you know, drop them down there in the comment section. I'll try to answer them if I can, if it's a question. And as far as like feedback, both positive and negative feedback is helpful. Helps me learn how to, you know, make better videos and you know, try to provide better content. And, you know, if you've seen this video and you liked it, you maybe seen some other stuff, you like those too, then I'd really appreciate a subscription. That'd help me out too. But with having all that been said, thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one.